Good morning, Magic! I'm Gavin Verhey from Wizards of the Coast, and today I want to talk about something that has been quite controversial in the comments: the threat of activation. What exactly is it, and how has it impacted our design? Let's get into it. You've seen it mentioned on the show before: threat of activation.
Threat of activation.
But what exactly is it? Magic is a game with a lot of strategic decisions. But from an optimal play standpoint, one truism generally holds with few exceptions. You want to wait and do things as late as possible because it gives you the most information. For example, if I have a 2/2 and you have a 3/3 and I have a giant growth, I don't want to cast it then attack. I want to attack, see if you block or not, and then cast it if you do. There's no reason for me to blow the information early. Similarly, if I have an Azure Mage and exactly 4 mana untapped, it's almost always better to just pass the turn and activate it in your end step. I won't have the mana to play anything I draw, and leaving up 4 mana to bluff having something is meaningful. This lends itself well to strategic depth, and interesting choices like combat tricks are part of what makes Magic such a great game. The problem starts to come with abilities that are on the table and impact what your opponent does. Let's take Nylea, God of the Hunt, as an example. You can pay 4 mana to give a creature +2/+2. So you have 3 2/2s and they have a 3/3. You attack with 2 of the 2/2s. Well, if they block, you'll just activate. So of course they don't block. But then you don't need to activate at all. You can just leave up the 4 mana. And on their turn, they still can't attack you because you'll block and make your creature a 4/4, so they can't attack either. To add insult to injury, that means your mana is still available at end of turn for any other instance you want to cast. For the cost of 0 actual mana, you have stymied your opponent from attacking or blocking on either turn. And this is the threat of activation. It's the idea that you don't even need to activate for something to be effective. Just the threat of it alone causes your opponent to warp their play. This most often appears on activated abilities, which can affect the board, but isn't limited to it. A classic threat of activation card is Silver Wyvern. By leaving up a single blue mana, your opponent will never target it with anything you could redirect to one of their creatures, creating a standoff where you always leave 1 blue mana up, and they never do anything to target it. So what are the problems with threat of activation abilities? Well, for one, it's the feels dumb moment. With either Nylea or Silver Wyvern, if you get got by the onboard trick, you're going to feel really silly. I tend to think the good strategic complexity in Magic comes from making the best decisions about what's on the board, not about if one player just forgets about an onboard trick. Threat of activation lies to people about what's on the board. When we were talking about Daxos and Melissa mentioned threat of activation, we mean that what happens is you quickly scan one player's board and see a tapped 2/2. But actually, if you attack them, they can pay 3 mana and create another much larger creature. Especially in a commander game, there's a ton to process, and that's easy to miss. I personally would let someone take this back, but not everyone is so generous with the takesy-backsies. Second, they can lead to standoffs. If I have a Nylea, 4 mana, and 1 2/2 blocker against your pair of 3/3s, the right play is for me to just say go. But similarly, the right play is for you to not attack me. This leads to me leaving up 4 mana each turn, not activating the ability, and the game not progressing. Third, and this one might surprise you, they can actually remove interesting decisions. Huh? Wouldn't letting you do more things on your opponent's turn increase strategy? Counterintuitively, no. Let me explain. As I mentioned earlier, the optimal play usually is to do things as late as possible, so you have as much information as possible. So once you learn this, you just default to waiting, seeing if you need to do something, and if not, just doing the best thing at your opponent's end step. It's not so much an interesting strategic choice as it is taking the option to just wait and make the best choice. Let's go back to Daxos. Imagine you have Daxos in play and a murder in your hand. The right play is usually to just pass the turn. Barring shenanigans like split second or counter magic, you want to wait to act as late as possible. There's no real choice here. If you need to murder something, you'll just murder it. Otherwise, you'll make a token at the player to your right's end step, or if someone attacks you. Now, imagine that same scenario, but if Daxos' ability had to be used only during your turn. Now you have an an actual decision. Do you want the extra creature, or do you want to pass on the creature but keep up the mana to defend yourself? And if you do pass on Daxos, are you okay signaling to other players this means you have a spell in your hand you might want to cast? That situation is way more interesting and has a lot more strategic depth than just having all options at all times. Much like I talked about in my recent Damage on the Stack short, doing things at more times doesn't necessarily make the game more strategic. Now, you might hear all of this and think that we hate cards which have threat of activation and are stopping them. And I want to give an enthusiastic no to that. While I've laid out the groundwork for their challenges, there's also a lot of good they do for us. We just try to be careful about how many of them there are and what effects they have. The optimal world is when your deck has a mix of both sorcery speed and instant speed activations. Going back to the previous sorcery speed Daxos and Murder example, it's in part so interesting precisely because you have two options, one of which is sorcery speed and one of which is instant speed. If default Magic was sorcery speed only, I think that would be a lot less fun. If you look at Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, setting aside the reconfigure cards which are equipment, there are 5 cards all with sorcery speed restrictions on them. And each of them is, in part, trying to prevent combat complexity, preventing Satsuki from causing your opponents to think about the cascading results of all your sagas during combat, or figuring out every permutation of what you could return with Tameshi. But on the flip side, you've got cards like Scrap Welder and Ruthless Technomancer, which don't have this restriction. One of the most important things about Magic design is doing things with intention. For a long time, we didn't even think that much about the difference between these two things. Now, we consciously ask every time if an ability should be sorcery or instant speed, and you'll see plenty of both in the future. Hopefully, this gives you better insight into what we're thinking about. But what do you think? Is there an example of a sorcery speed restriction you wish was doable at any time? Or maybe the other way around? Let me know in the comments down below. I'll talk with you again soon, and until then, may you have the mana for all your abilities. You got this! My definition of an infinite combo is 2 or more cards that interact together to do something an unbounded number of times that will lead to either immediately winning the game or boundless mana, since boundless mana can often win you the game. And yes, to those typing fervently in the comments, I know in Magic that you have to choose a number, so